Hi, it's Mike from Apollo, and we are here once again for the Growth Engine. And we are joined by a very special person. This person, his name is Colin Kinner. He has over 20 years of helping startups. And you know what? He's still alive. He's surviving. He's doing it. He's the CEO of Startup On Ramp. He's a bit of a legend of the Australian startup scene, and he is here with us today. Colin, how you doing?
I'm good. Thanks, mate. Always good to talk to you.
And you too. I'm always a little bit jealous that you have such a good studio setup. I always feel like we're on broadcast television when we're talking together.
We're only one trip away from Bunnings to level up anyone's studio. So
They, for all the
that's what's involved.
Australian viewers, yeah, that is the Home Depot, if you will, of Australia. Colin, you've spent so many years helping startups. You've helped thousands of them, and they couldn't get enough of you. So you've decided to build your own AI product of you that has all this magic of you. I'm very interested to learn more about it, but most importantly, why do that now? What was going on in your mind? What was the conversation to say, it's time to build this product which distills the magic inside of me? Why?
Sure. Well, there's probably a couple of parts to that. The first is that I think probably a bit like you, I've seen every way there is possible to fail in a startup. So, it always frustrates me. I try and help startup founders, particularly early stage, in the first 2 or 3 years to kind of make a good start. And it always worries me when I see startup founders doing things that you look at and you go, yeah, that's really going to make it really tough for you. Building the wrong, all the stuff that, you and I have seen many times. So that's kind of the background in which I kind of look at the startup ecosystem and think, look, there's a lot of founders out there who aren't in an accelerator program. They don't have access to, someone like you who can give them, really good guidance and share your own experience, and they're winging it. So, wouldn't it be nice if we could help more of those folks? And at the same time, I mean, obviously right now, AI is changing everything. The whole world is changing really rapidly. And I think there's an opportunity to build AI tools that help people with very specific tasks. And we've seen, there's a flood of AI tools that are the receptionist for your doctor's surgery or to book, at your golf course or whatever. My kind of domain expertise is working with startup founders. And so it seemed to me it'd be really helpful to build an AI tool that can do some of the work that I would do and that, experienced folks like you would do with startup founders, but to do it on a scalable level. There's also the kind of maybe slightly cynical argument to this, which is someone is going to build that AI tool that replaces you and me and many others. Let's not say replace, let's say augments, but over time we'll do more and more of what we do. And if someone's going to do that, I might as well build the AI tool that replaces me rather than sit around and wait for that to happen.
Well, yeah, so that's almost like a deliberate self-cannibalization, if you want to call it that, right?
Yeah, and I actually don't think that we're going to see AI startup coaches replacing human mentors or coaches anytime soon. I think it is a case of augmenting. And one of the things that I find really interesting in the kind of AI landscape is that people often use AI for stuff that they would have done anyway, and it makes them a bit better, a bit more efficient. But I'm kind of taking the view that, what's the thing that I would never dream of doing? And that's, doing the kind of deep dive research on, every one of potentially thousands of startups, but AI can do that. So it's a leverage question more than a replacement question, I think.
I couldn't agree more because I see that for myself. So I want to ask you about this question. I'm seeing a lot of startups which have the following characteristic. Very deep domain expert, usually with 10 to 20 years of experience, building some sort of AI product that is complementing their capability set. So for example, there is AI Buyer, who's part of the ATC cohort. The gentleman that's the founder of that, his first name is King. King has like 30 plus years in procurement. He's building an amazing procurement add-on tool for himself and other procurement advisors. I'm seeing this pattern. In fact, Y Combinator just did a video on 40 plus experts are the new like gold rush of founders who are now able to build things they couldn't have dreamt of before. Are you seeing that model? And tell me, does that model somewhat relate to you? And what do you see around this new wave of startups?
Yeah, that resonates. So I see a lot of startup founders who have that deep domain expertise. And Interestingly, so over the last 9 years, Startup On Ramp's run a whole bunch of different programs. We've worked with about 2,000 founders, and looking across all of those founders, the average age is 42. So we're not seeing, 21-year-olds, not really knowing much about the world and jumping into, starting a company. We're seeing people who've been in industry, who've, got deep domain expertise in whatever field. And 5 years ago, even a couple of years ago, they were saying, you know what, I don't want to work for the rest of my life as an employee in, a bank or whatever. I'm going to build a company. We're still seeing that, but we're also seeing people going, you know what, I've realized that a lot of what I do could be done by AI, or at least significantly augmented by AI. I really want to try and do that.
I had the funniest thing, as all good Australians, Colin, as you will know, we go to the dermatologist for a health check because we're all getting sunburnt like crazy. And my dermatologist in my annual health check tells me that she has a successful startup and that they've already got revenue. And it's my dermatologist, Colin.
Interesting. Yeah. We have a skin cancer specialist in our founder community, a lady who is building some products leveraging her dermatology and skin cancer expertise. And it's really, it's a phenomenon.
I don't know
Like
what they're
it's,
doing. Maybe they're having too much coffee, those dermatologists, but it sounds like there's a lot there where you see that domain expertise. You also see
Mm.
like a nice use case where there's like, you have an image, so you can take an image of the skin, you can evaluate it. In fact, I was reading about some research that a number of medical professions that are using AI to look at scans in a number of domains are actually growing as a result because they're adding more value, doing more scans, more patient
Mm.
sessions. And obviously, with the burdens of an aging population in healthcare, actually, this is starting to make a real difference in the capacity of any
Mm.
sort of specialist that needs to take a photo or a video of the human body, that this augmentation through AI is really helping them.
Yeah, totally. And I don't think enough people are thinking about what are all of the use cases for AI where it's doing something that currently nobody would do. So I mentioned before, like with the founder coach, it does a whole bunch of research that is too time intensive for me to do, or for, any kind of experienced startup coach. We've all seen there's the classic example that I think everyone's heard of, which is the pool company that got satellite data across a large area. I think they're an American company.
Mm.
Satellite data. They used AI to analyze it, find the backyards that were big enough to put a pool in, but where there wasn't currently a pool, then to generate a video, so an AI generated video showing the pool being constructed in their backyard, and then the finished product, and then emailing it to the homeowner and saying, hey, would you like this? Because we can build you a pool. And like they can do that times 100,000, and no pool building company would do that any other way. So this is kind of like a new way of thinking about doing stuff that, is no, it's not a replacement or making a human task more efficient. It's saying, what are the new tasks?
Yes, and I don't want to be an AI apologist because that's like a separate show that we should do
Mm.
again together. But I'm always struck by the lessons of history. When electricity was put into the grid in the early 1900s, there was a lot of concerns about what that was going to do. When automobiles were added in the early part of the 19th century, there was a lot of concern from the Horse and Carriage Association of New York, for example. And then all of a sudden, electricity creates a platform by which we need a lot of electricians and all the industries that come on the top of that, home
Mm.
fittings, etc. And of course, you have the car industry as well. We never realized how many mechanics we were going to need. So I think we're still figuring that out, Colin, to your point. But I want to take you back to something that you mentioned, which is around this domain expertise. And
Mm.
personally for you, in creating this augmented product, this AI coach, which comes off the back of the work that you do at Startup On Ramp, what was the skill that you have developed inside of you personally?
Mm.
What was the one skill that you really wanted to put into the product? Like, what's the secret sauce
Yeah.
that happens for you that you had to transfer, and take us through that journey?
Sure. So fundamentally, I'm well known with the founders that I work with as a serial asker of devil's advocate questions. So I feel like as a startup coach, that's probably one of the more important parts of your role. It's not to tell people the answers and say, hey, you should do, steps 1, 2, and 3. It's really to say, well, okay, tell me where you're at. And then they tell you, and then you say, okay, well, how did you arrive at that conclusion? And, what are your competitors doing? And, just asking lots and lots of questions. And that's actually really hard to get an AI agent to do out of the box. People will have experience in talking to ChatGPT or Claude or whatever. And, we all know that there's a sycophancy tendency, and they tend to say, oh, Mike, that's a really good idea. Fascinating. So a lot of the work that's gone into building the AI founder coach is trying to emulate that stuff that I think good human startup coaches do, which is to grill the founder on their assumptions and say, well, how do you know that's true? Not in a kind of a harsh, critical way, but, to explore that space and say, well, really, do you know that the customers want what it is you're building? And how many have you talked to? And, are they people that are going to tell you what they think you want to hear, or are they really arm's length people that are going to tell you if they think it's a really, hopeless product? So there's a lot of that has gone into it. There's also the stuff that, we were talking about earlier where, I think to add value to a startup founder, sure, if you've got experience, as you and I do, in working with lots of startups, you can have that kind of pattern matching that says, well, okay, I suspect that for this founder at this stage that they're at, here are a few things that might be useful for them to think about or to do next or whatever. But I feel like that's only part of the story. And the bit that I wish I could do when I'm working with a founder is to say, well, okay, before we have that kind of conversation, I'll go and do like 2 days of research. I'll read every website, every page on the websites of every one of your competitors. I'll read all the TechCrunch articles about your sector. I'll, do a bunch of other research. I'll go talk to some, other customers, and I'll understand all this stuff. And then I'll, if I could do that, I feel like I'd add a lot more value in that conversation. But, that's really hard. That doesn't scale.
No sleep for you, Colin.
No sleep for me. But I mean, the reality is that, for 99% of founders, that's just not something that they can do. And I don't have the time to do that times, hundreds of startups either. But AI can do that really well. So that's a big part of the kind of back end of the product, is doing that kind of deep dive research so that it shows up in the first call with the user and can say, all right, well, I know a little bit about your company and your sector, and let's kind of jump in based on that context rather than, hey, tell me what you do.
Yes. Because, personally, what I relate to is if you have to do that on a call with a startup founder, building the context before you ask the questions, getting those questions answered before you can start leading towards a destination, that can be a multi-call, multi-week process. Yeah. So with it, in the absence of context. So what's interesting is you've sort of distilled how to be, you said devil's advocate, but I interpret that as well as being a little bit challenging, making sure that there's assumptions are based in some evidence, maybe making the founder aware that there's not enough evidence before they go and build like crazy, but also that kind of data synthesis of context in order to move that process of asking those questions, moving it at faster. Now, what we should do though is we should pause, Colin. If someone wants to actually jump on the tools and have a look at this AI coach, where do we find this in the universe?
It's at startuponramp.com. So it's on our website. It's recently launched. We've had a bunch of people using it, and you've had the experience of chatting with the founder coach. It's an interesting experience, and I'm really interested in getting people's feedback on chatting with an AI coach, because this is a new thing for most people.
But this brings me to something that you did very well, and by the way, we'll have a link in the description as well. You've built this with a lot of AI tooling, and one of the places I wanted to start hearing a little bit like how you built it is the quality of the voice discussion with the virtual coach was really high quality. And as a bit of a sound, audio, music guy, that would have been one of the areas your product could have really sounded very robotic. How on earth did you solve for and build something that does the devil's advocate, asking those questions, builds context, but the delivery in the UI UX is beautiful. So tell us how you did that and give us a little bit of a sense of how you built this product.
Sure. The aim at a really fundamental level is for the user to experience it as if it's one voice agent. So like to chat away to, he's called Richard, to be able to chat to Richard and feel like, each time you chat to him, he remembers what you talked about last time. Behind the scenes, there's about 20 different agents all doing various tasks. So the voice part of it, I'm glad you found it a good kind of experience, because that is, I think, really important, that it feels like talking to a person. So we were fortunate enough to get a startup grant from 11 Labs, which is the world's leading voice AI technology company. And so we've been able to make a lot of progress there in building natural sounding AI agents. And it's been really interesting actually to see some people will jump into the first part of the call with Richard, and what they expect is like an IVR, the thing where you ring up the call center and it says, if you're calling about,
Press
to
one.
make a complaint, press one. And they give the kind of, one sentence or one word answers. But even those folks, as soon as they kind of get a couple of minutes into the call, they kind of go, all right, this is just like talking to someone. Cool. I'll just have a chat. So one of the learnings was that you need to build at the edge of the capabilities of the currently available LLMs, right?
Mm-hmm.
So, and this is a common piece of advice a lot of startup founders hopefully are getting. If you're building something that is well within the capabilities of even the kind of cheaper models, that's a really tough place to be. So with this particular product, when I started building it 6 or 9 months ago, thereabouts, it was really not possible to get it to do a good job, because if you think about what the coach has to do as a voice agent, it can't just give you a bunch of text. It has to engage in a back and forth. And every time you say something, it has to respond appropriately and say, well, okay, what does that mean
Yeah.
for what I'm going to say next? So we're now at a point where that voice agent can use the frontier models. So it's currently using an Opus model, which is very capable of doing
Mm.
that kind of reasoning on the fly. Maybe someday we'll get Fable back at the time of
If you're lucky.
recording. We'll see.
If you're lucky.
There's a balance, of course, between capability and latency, but I think we've struck a good point with the voice agent part of it, where the capability is really there. And the thing that I'm really excited about is that's only going to improve, because the underlying LLM capability, as we all know, is improving extremely rapidly. So that's I think a good place to be with that part of it. Then all the underlying stuff, the stuff that you don't see as a user, is I think all the bit that the back end is fundamentally a bunch of N8N workflows. So I'm a big believer in kind of the visual building part of N8N. And it's a really intuitive way to build things where you can see kind of, tasks progressing
Mm.
over time for each user.
Quite a nice drag and drop look at steps, connectors. Like you
Mm,
can visualize the workflow as well as building it. I think that's
yeah,
what N8N does really quite well. I'm
yeah.
interested that you chose that and perhaps not something more agentic, or perhaps even more classic, like a workflow stepper that
Mm.
was built in React or Node or something like this. Why the choice for N8N? Interesting.
Yeah, it works really well for the way the AI founder coach works. Is there's some deterministic steps, and then there's some agentic steps where you need an orchestration agent. So the deterministic stuff works really well in N8N, because it's been used for years as a kind of a workflow builder, where you can say, look, okay, when a user onboards, you do these things.
Hmm.
That's non-negotiable. That happens. Then there are some parts of the product where we need to make decisions on the fly. So, for example, how mature is this company? Is it an MVP stage? Have they launched? Are they, getting ready to raise a funding round? And then the agent gets to make decisions about, well, what do I do next? What's most important to this founder? Do I help them to explore the funding landscape? Are they ready for that? Should I give them some advice that says, actually, if you haven't got any revenues yet, trying to raise money from a VC might not be the best use of your time. Let's backtrack to how do we get some early customers and get some revenue?
Okay, so there is like a big story about systems thinking in the back. I'm hearing
Mm,
workflows and processes, if this, then that,
mm,
inputs and outputs, and then the delivery system with the 11 labs and the voice, which I must say was really impressive, because there's a lot of thinking happening in the background that you
mm,
reference.
mm.
What was really nice is there wasn't a big delay in the conversation. It felt very natural. The
Yeah,
fact that it sounded natural, the timing and latency was natural, but we were actually having a conversation, me and your AI coach, that actually made sense.
yeah,
It was a very special moment. So those insights are great for any founder, understanding that there is that presentation layer, right? And delivering that experience and matching that with the logic and the things happening in the background that are actually creating a lot of the value, the context. asking the devil's advocate questions.
Yeah, for sure. And I think, one of the things that I'm really looking forward to with the product is the ability to work with founders over a longer period of time. Because one of the insights behind this is that if you have an AI agent that engages with a founder multiple times, it develops a compounding knowledge of that company, and it understands stuff about, its current situation, the challenges that it's facing. It knows the founder and kind of what their objectives are, knows the industry, all that stuff. And so, you and I would do this with founders if we're working with them over an extended period, but we can only do that with, how many can you work with at a time,
I
Mike?
know.
You know,
I
it's
know.
it's certainly not, triple figures or more. So that to me is kind of the medium term and long term opportunity here, is to say, if you look at an ecosystem, whether we're talking about the Australian startup ecosystem or the US or any other, you know, body of startup founders, you've probably got like 1% of those founders are taking part in a program of some sort, whether it's an accelerator or they've got some access to some experienced mentors. The 99% don't, right? So they're winging it and watching YouTube videos and stuff. And so like that to me is the kind of the long-term value that I hope we can realize. So I've spent a lot of time on the kind of startup ecosystem strategy stuff, looking at it, particularly in Australia, how do we do better at supporting more startups and creating more, really successful companies? And one part of that is you have to put a lot of things in the top of the funnel. You have to have thousands of people starting, but then
Yes.
you have to not have a really, horrific attrition rate where they all fail, and especially early on. So you want to help as many of those founders make progress as you possibly can, so that at the bottom of the funnel, instead of one unicorn, you might have 20 unicorns.
Colin, you're sounding dangerously like a startup founder. You're eating your own dog food in many ways. So why don't we talk a little bit now beyond your product? And by the way, I want to call out, link in the description for Colin's AI coach for startups. Thousands of founders, 20 plus years. What do you see? What has never changed about the founders that thrive? What is it that you have, with that body, that sample data is huge. What's the pattern to founders that thrive, that do well, and perhaps on the other side, those that really struggle? What have you seen in your career? Like, what's the map?
Yeah, I think if I look at all the founders that have been really successful, it's a bunch of things. Like, probably top of the list for me is a high level of agency. These are people that fundamentally believe inside their brain that if they work really hard, they can do things that most people wouldn't think are possible. So it's got to be balanced by a sense of realism, so that if they encounter some facts, their brain has to also be able to process the facts and say, okay, that maybe needs to shift my thinking. But I generally think that successful founders have a high degree of unreasonableness. And that doesn't generally mean that, they're unpleasant people to work with. It means that they really have an idea of what they want to achieve. And for the most part, they're not going to be dissuaded. And so I see a lot of people that kind of go, I've got this idea for a startup, or I've got this product that I'm kind of working on. And as soon as somebody says, I don't think that makes any sense, they kind of go, oh, no, that's a real shame.
Yeah, like the wind is out of their sails. They're adrift. Right?
Yeah. So the unreasonable founders are the ones that go, yeah, okay, well, I'll listen to what you're saying, but I'll factor that in proportional to how much you really know about this space.
Right.
So I think there's a level of nuance there. So if, really sharp founders will say, if I'm talking to somebody who is representative of my ideal customer profile, I'll really listen hard, right? Or if they're an investor who's invested in 20 companies in my space, I'll really listen. But if there's some random person, I'm not taking that on board.
That's interesting. So agency, that they're unreasonable. I mean, I process that a little bit like very resilient, like they're not put off course.
Yep.
A lot of drive. And what's perhaps a classic signal you see in a founder that kind of establishes, you would walk away go, I'm not sure this is going to last very long. What's a big tell? And the reason I want to talk about that, Colin, is I think it's really important that we frame this. That this is probably, for most people, will be the Mount Everest of their life, doing a startup, right?
Yep.
Lots of risk, lots of challenge. So I just don't want people jumping in under some romantic notion that this is going to be like Silicon Valley, here we come. It's probably going to be how much money is left in the bank situation.
For sure. Yeah. I mean, I think if I look at founders that struggle, one of the the most common things is they really find it difficult to assimilate bad news. And so I was talking to a friend of mine who's a psychologist recently about this, and there's a concept psychologists refer to as post-decisional cognitive dissonance leading to denial, right?
Oof.
So I'll unpack that. So the post-decisional bit is you make a decision, hey, I'm going to start a company or I'm going to build this product and it's going to be, my thing I'm going to work on. When you do that, you're emotionally invested and your brain kind of locks in and says, okay, that's what I'm doing. If that person's then presented with evidence or some facts that conflict with their decision to pursue this opportunity, that's uncomfortable, right? So, hey, Mike, you've just started this company and you're going to launch this fantastic product. And then Colin shows up and says, hey, Mike, here are like 10 competitors that appear to be doing pretty much exactly the same thing. And they've all raised hundreds of millions of dollars. Inside your brain, you're getting cognitive dissonance that says, oh, that's maybe not good. I've invested time and money and, and my reputation in building this thing. This could be bad. And so some people struggle with that cognitive dissonance so much that they block it out and they say, nah, my brain's not computing that. It's not happening. And it seems like a surprising thing, but it happens all the time. I mean, so you see this with people who, are smokers, for example, right? And you say, hey, here's the evidence that says smoking really bad. They continue smoking. And a part of the reason they do that is that, and studies have looked at this, is that their brain goes, yeah, no, I'm not accepting that evidence. It's just not going into my head. So to bring that back to startup founders, the denial piece is when you see startup founders, and I've had this conversation with many founders, where you'll raise a question about, the direction they're going in, and you can almost see the cogs turning in their head where they're going to go, yeah, no, that's really uncomfortable. I don't want to hear that.
Yeah.
And so they then engage in denial and they just pursue on the path, continue pursuing the path that they started off on.
Yes. And I'm stealing a bit of a Charlie Mungerism here, but I think that if you were to juxtapose that with what does work, and that is seeing yourself as a learning machine. And in that journey, you can be very stubborn on the vision that you have for the impact that you want to have, but you can be amazingly flexible in how you get there, because the tension to kind of show you back the moment that I see is that founders have built a very fixed idea of how they win. And over time, they're very inflexible about adjusting that. Maybe I sell direct, or maybe I go through partners to distribute. And when they're presented with an alternate way of doing it, they reject that because they're so fixated, so fixed on what they think is best.
Yep. Yeah. And I suspect part of that ties back to this thing that, successful founders often are passionate about the problem, but really lukewarm about their particular solution, at least in the early days. And, you've encountered this, I'm sure. The ones that say, look, I really, really want to solve this problem. It's, I will eat, sleep, and breathe the problem. I'll work on it, for 10 years. And, there's even the kind of tell that says, is this a founder who would probably work on this problem, even if there wasn't like, a big commercial opportunity, even if it was a project rather than a, opportunity to build a, really successful company around it. If so, that's a really good sign, because it probably means that they're in their mind, they're flexible about what exactly the solution looks like. And maybe even to the extent of saying what I came in with is actually the wrong solution altogether, right? So they're going to be more resilient, back to what you're saying before. They're going to be more resilient about, I've had some feedback that, from my early customers that maybe that wasn't the right product, but no problem. Like, I'm still passionate about solving the problem in some way.
And when you remove that resistance, I think founders will feel like the world can open up. Obviously, the key thing here is like, making sure you're staying true to that original mission, who you wanted to help and why. Yeah. Well, let's now apply this learning machine to you, Colin.
Sure.
Put you on the hot seat.
Sure.
What was a belief or a mental model that you had in the early days that you have since discovered was not right, or that has changed wildly?
Yeah, probably the main one for me is that this kind of maybe slightly naive belief that if you give people information, they'll act on it. And I actually don't think that's always true. And it's often like 180 degrees the other way. So I feel like we talked about the cognitive dissonance part, but there's more to it than that. I think, people's brains are overloaded. If you're a startup founder, you've got 100 jobs that you're meant to do. In parallel, you're meant to be an expert on sales and marketing and product and everything else. So I feel like one of the kind of assumptions that I'd always had, maybe partly it's my kind of analytical default mindset that says, give me the information, then I'll make decisions based on that. I think for a lot of founders, giving them information is just more overload. And so there actually needs to be some distillation of that says, well, here's what it means. And like, let's boil it down to like 3 actions. So not replacing the thinking, not saying we're not going to look at the info, or we're not going to look at the kind of data. I'm just going to give you like 3 actions. That's not helpful. But I think one realization I've had is that you need to, give people the kind of next steps.
Yeah. I think it's a very delicate situation when you're helping a founder and you're trying to present facts, create time and space for analysis, and then draw the right conclusions and next steps. What do you personally find is the most important thing to do when you are coaching? We're now in the IRL version of Colin.
Sure.
In real life, when you are in that moment, what comes to your mind when you're trying to lead the founder to a destination? How do you try and show up to get that end result? So we know the process that you've described, but how do you personally try and show up for them? I mean, I would be very interested to know how you try and get them to that outcome. Do you leave a lot of time and space? Do you lean back, lean in? Yeah, give us a little bit more on that.
Yeah, I prefer, wherever possible, to work with founders over multiple touch points rather than the kind of, hey, we've got an hour, let's, try and cram everything into it and I'll try and add some value. Because I think it can be useful, but it's generally really hard to add a lot of value. So what I try and do is say, look, we've got multiple touch points. For example, they're going through a pre-accelerator. We run a bunch of kind of 8-week programs, meet with them on a regular basis over that period. So that means that we can devote 1 or 2 sessions to saying, I'm pretty much not going to say anything. I'm just going to ask maybe a few questions to get the founder to kind of unpack. And a lot of that tends to be, what are your goals? I think we tend to, in the startup scene, we tend to default to this kind of assumption that says everyone is building a venture scale company and everyone needs to go and raise like $100 million and everyone wants to build a unicorn. Some people, yes, but there are other people that, for example, I'm working with a medical professional at the minute who's in one of our programs and their objective is not to stop being a medical professional, right? So this is a person who's put, many years of their career and, lots of hard work into becoming, an expert in their field. So for them, the startup they're building has to sit alongside that. Like that's a non-negotiable. So like, I think it's really important to do that kind of, what are the parameters? What are your goals? What's realistic?
Yeah. I think it's vastly underestimated that doing a startup for real, I want to caveat this by saying not necessarily raising capital, but just doing a startup for real. You're all in. This is your life's work. You want to create a ton of value. That this is as much a personal choice as it is a professional choice. And this would have to be, Colin, one of the most underestimated things, like the things you didn't know when you started. I think that one's got to be a big one, right?
For sure. Yeah. I mean, you can go too far with that. Obviously, if you're too candid, if people really understand the odds of success, a lot of them wouldn't start, right?
Yeah.
So this is where it comes back to the agency and some amount of unreasonableness to be able to say, okay, I understand that 10% or whatever the number is of startups make it and the 90% don't, but I'm not going to be in the 90.
Very well put. Yes. Yes. Okay. So now let's talk about where you're at. 20 plus years, more than 2,000 founders have been helped, supported, nudged. You're signing up with this new product. Where are you personally getting your energy for this next chapter from? Like what's driving you, motivating you? What's keeping you inside working and not those beautiful Queensland beaches? Yeah, what's the source of this new chapter? What's the energy?
Yeah, I mean, for me, a lot of it comes from the work that I did before Startup On-Ramp existed, which was on the ecosystem building as a bigger picture initiative. So if I go back to about 2013, I wrote the first of the Startup Oz Crossroads reports, which at the time was, so Startup Oz is effectively, or was at the time, the kind of industry body for the startup sector in Australia. And there were about 50 of us got together in Sydney and said, hey, you know what? We've got a good start in the kind of ecosystem in Australia, but we feel like there's more that could be done. What should we do as a collective of people that are passionate about seeing this sector grow? And for my sins, I put my hand up and said, well, how about I'll volunteer to write like a little discussion paper? So I did, and it turned out that what was going to be like a 5-page thing ended up being an 80 or 90-page report, and it looked really deep at the current landscape in Australia and then the international landscape and said, well, what's everyone else doing? What can we learn from looking at other ecosystems in other countries? And what are the things that we need to do better here? And I came up with about 20 recommended actions for Australia, and we then refined that over 2 subsequent reports that wrote as well. And I remember at the time, we looked at the VC landscape as one of the kind of data points. And we realized that the amount of venture capital invested by Australian VCs into startups each year was less than the amount that was bet on the Melbourne Cup horse race in one day every year.
Oh my gosh. Has that
So
changed?
that's
Has that
changed massively. So, we've come a very long way from those days. And so a lot of the actions that we looked at in that initial report have been acted on by the ecosystem or by federal government or state governments. And so that's really encouraging. But so a lot of the work that I'm doing through Startup On-Ramp is really looking at one of the key areas that was identified as a gap in the Australian ecosystem. And that is, we've got lots of people who could be awesome startup founders, but they're kind of winging it. And so, if we were sitting here having this conversation in, let's say, Palo Alto, most likely, within like walking distance of wherever we are, there's like 10 or 20 other startup founders that we could say, hey, what should I do here? What's your advice? And they go, well, when I did my 5th company, here's what I did. And you could learn from that. In Sydney, to some extent, you've got that. In other capital cities, to some extent. When you go out of capital cities, you really don't have much of that at all. And so I still see that one of the really fundamental things we need to get better at is helping founders to make a good start and not have to learn everything from first principles and trial and error.
Yes. And I mean, that's a huge addressable market for you and what you're doing, not only in your programs at Startup On-Ramp with the product as well, but that level of impact. I think that's a really beautiful way of talking about a legacy that you can look to and say, well, look, I've really been able to contribute to that change, right?
For sure. And, for those of us who've got kids, you look at, what kind of career path they're going to have. If they're in Australia, I'd like to think that the options are more varied and interesting than I'm going to work for a bank or an insurance company or a mining company.
Yes. Or a real estate company, huh?
For sure. Yep.
Okay. So we're talking a lot now about this next chapter for you. What I thought would be really nice to wrap up this conversation would be if a founder was to join us right now and all they have is an idea, big idea.
Sure.
Here we are, 2026, where there is tons of compute, cloud, AI infrastructure, world's your oyster, but all they've got is an idea. Colin, what advice, where do we start? Where do you anchor that founder in? They've just got an idea. What happens now?
Yeah. So, one of the fundamental questions is what kind of idea? Is it something that you can vibe code into existence in a couple of weekends? Or is it deep tech where, this is going to be meaningful R&D and you need to, actually build a physical product? And also the stuff that we talked about earlier around, what are your ambitions? Let's not assume that everyone's building a swing for the fences, VC backable kind of business. So I think, once the founder has thought about, which of those paths they want to follow, if it is something 80-90% of the companies that I'm seeing going through our programs at the minute are, either building an AI product or using AI heavily to help them create their product. So that being the case, I used to say, especially to non-tech founders, don't build really anything. Like the last thing you should do is build a product, for the reason that the time and for a lot of folks, the cost means that they only get one shot on goal.
Yeah.
Right. So if you're a technical founder or you've got a team and you can just, invest a little bit of your time and build something, awesome. But certainly the case is in Australia, it's true that a large proportion of all founders are non-technical or probably like me, semi-technical, right? So they can build some stuff, but there's a time cost to actually building things. I used to say to those folks, build a landing page, drive some traffic to it, go interview 100 customers, do all of the kind of classic, lean startup customer development stuff before you build anything. I've totally changed my advice on that in the last 12 or 18 months to the point where I now say, if it is a thing that you can, vibe code into existence, even if it's a bit crappy, like in a month, or if, for some people it's a weekend, like totally do that. Just build it. Because you can have 20 shots on goal. You can build something, show it to a few potential customers, get some feedback, and then throw it away. And that's fine, like, because you can build another thing next weekend.
And I think it's really important to signpost here that even if you and I were having this conversation 5 years ago, we would have
Mm.
said, oh, you need to build, or if you need to build a product, it's one shot on goal. You probably need to go get anywhere from 50 to 250K just to build the prototype. That's how prohibitive it was to enter
Mm.
into the product space.
Sure.
So it is really phenomenal in a lifetime what we've seen change. And this has a
Yeah.
lot of consequence because, Colin, one of the other things I see, if people do need to raise capital, they must go to a VC and say, I have built a product on version 3. I have 300 paying customers. Let's talk. 5 years ago, you would have said, can I have 250K to build a prototype so I can get my first customer?
For sure. And unfortunately, for the most part, the answer was no. That sounds really interesting, what you're telling me, but, come back when you've got your first paying customers.
Yeah. Yeah. Vibe killer, actually.
Yeah, for sure.
Yeah.
Yeah. And, a lot of people then kind of defaulted to looking for government grants. And like government grants can be helpful, but I don't think that they're kind of the panacea. They're not a solution to that kind of chicken and egg problem of, hey, I need money to get customers and I need customers to generate revenue. So somebody's got to fill the gap, and is it the government? Sometimes, sure, that can be really helpful, but I sort of feel like, the right path for a lot of startups is to say, well, I will build the team that can create the product without having to go and find some third party to give me, a couple $100K or whatever the amount is.
Yes. Sounds like a lot of those founders, Colin, need an AI coach of some sort.
Yeah, I think so, but I'm biased. But I mean, I think I said to you before, I am using the AI founder coach to coach me, and I'm finding it really interesting because I'm realizing that the hypothesis that I started out with was that as its knowledge of a particular startup compounds, it'll get more and more useful. And that's proving to be the case. So, I mean, I guess it probably makes sense because you and I would experience that if we were,
Yes.
working with a founder. The more you know about them, the more useful you are. But I think that's underappreciated, and I still find it really strange. I see people, chatting with ChatGPT or Claude, and they'll ask a question, and they get something back, and they do it again, but there's none of that compounding knowledge. So, it's kind of.
I think what you're revealing there, Colin, is almost the secret sauce to that consultant with augmented tool. I think you're actually revealing quite the playbook, which is it keeps context, it asks those tough questions and guides you through the process when you're ready on demand. And particularly for that early stage in your customer life cycle, maybe before they even come to your program, they can do a lot of that work with your product. And I think if anyone listening to this conversation is a subject matter expert, they can be thinking about what you're doing, what I'm doing with Signum, which is to build products that augment us in the real world that we use. So we eat our own dog food, but then we can make available to people like us.
For sure. That's exactly it.
Colin, what are you most looking forward to at this juncture? It's a new chapter. There's a new product. What's the thing that gets you jumping out of bed to jump on the tools to get into Claude? What is it that is really exciting in this next step for you?
Yeah, look, it's probably impact. Back to what we were talking about before, I think, there's no doubt there's a good opportunity here to build, a thing that scales. But if I go back to, for me, the why, why I'm in this space at all, it's fundamentally that, as a country, we need to get better at this stuff. We need to, and we have an opportunity to, to do a lot of really rapid startup growth. And so I find it really motivating to think that, there's things that we can do that have leverage in that kind of ecosystem building landscape where we could say, well, instead of working with 10 startups at a time, we could help 1,000 startups. Like, that'd be cool.
I subscribe to that. That's why I think it's the best time to be alive. And I think it is awesome to hear the journey you've been on, being the devil's advocate, creating the context. And what's really exciting is to see that after 20 years, you're alive and kicking, you're turbocharged, you've got the Red Bull. There's another 20 years at an even greater scale, Colin.
Thanks, Mike. I appreciate that. I don't feel old at all after all those comments.
There you go. There you go. Colin, thanks for being on the show. Where does everyone find you in the universe? Hit us with some easy ways to find you on the internet.
Yeah, I'm on LinkedIn, pretty active, and obviously at startuponramp.com, and always love to talk to founders and people who are building cool stuff.
So, all right, Colin, thank you for joining us today. And thank you to you, all of our listeners and viewers. Check out the show description for all the links to Colin's great work, and we'll catch you next time.